Nearly 25 years after the Soviet Union unraveled, the Cold War waged between the US and the USSR has taken on a nostalgic and even romantic feel. But the thrilling tales of espionage involving dead drops and ciphers always had something not even a little bit romantic looming over them: the real threat of nuclear war. CounterSpy, available on PS4, PS3, and Vita, mixes these two elements up artfully, taking advantage of what we remember fondly of the Cold War era and combining it with the fear of an apocalypse. Its stealth platformer gameplay isn't quite as strong as its stunning art direction and musical score, but its take on an important era of global history is novel and welcome. There's an old saying about history, that it's written by the victors. The beauty of CounterSpy is that it doesn't predicate its story on the historical outcome of the Cold War. Instead, it throws us right into the middle of the conflict as an agent of a neutral organization known as Counter. What's clever about Counter is that it's not fighting for one side or the other. It's fighting for what, in retrospect, is the only sane goal in this situation: sabotage the nuclear programs of both superpowers before they destroy each other and, inevitably, the world. What I really love about this setup is that the developer, Dynamite, deliberately paints both sides as equal agitators in a completely pointless, ever-escalating conflict. CounterSpy even declines to name the belligerents, instead calling the US the imperialists and the Soviet Union the socialists. By doing this, focus remains on the silliness of both sides' approach to the Cold War, essentially building humorous caricatures to cut both sides down to size. Still, you'll be able to readily recognize the US and USSR. Their respective bases are designed to reflect the American and Soviet aesthetic of the time. CounterSpy looks and sounds beautiful, heavily borrowing from Cold War era books, movies, TV shows, and comics to create something authentic. CounterSpy is built in the same spirit as Super Metroid, Castlevania Symphony of the Night, and Shadow Complex, but in super bite-sized morsels that total around 3 or 4 hours, which is a welcome change of pace. The socialist and imperialist bases aren't two different environments for you to explore. You'll actually infiltrate various procedurally generated bases over and over again, combing them for precious launch plans, as well as weapon blueprints, skill formulas, and cold hard cash. They'll either be manned by Americans or Russians, with walls adorned with propaganda and flags fitting the side, but otherwise the missions play out the same regardless of which side you're infiltrating. Missions typically take no more than 10 or 15 minutes each, and involve the shadowy agent you control slinking through bases, killing soldiers as he goes, collecting as much as he can from the environment, and getting out before things get too hairy. Some might prefer a meatier experience here, but I liked how CounterSpy strayed away from massive maps and dozens of hours of gameplay for something more bite-sized. There are plenty of Metroidvania games that have real substance. There's also room for tinier games like CounterSpy. Gunplay is unique in CounterSpy, but it's also quite finicky, with controls that are sometimes pesky to nail just right. It's a side-scroller at heart, but when you take cover, your perspective changes. How you engage with foes will determine how they react to you. For instance, being quiet and using a silencer on your pistol will allow you to pick off enemies unawares. You could also go in guns blazing, which is less elegant, but perhaps just as practical. This is perhaps CounterSpy's biggest differentiator, and it looks pretty, though it doesn't solve the gameplay conundrum either in terms of gunplay or another glaring issue. Enemy AI is wildly inconsistent. Sometimes they'll see you with nary a glance. Other times I got through entire rooms without raising an alarm, all the while wondering how I managed to do it. These AI inconsistencies and wonky gunplay don't ruin CounterSpy, but they do diminish it, especially as difficulty ramps up in later stages, and as you try to chase trophies and beat harder difficulty settings. Still, there's something satisfying about building guns and creating skills from formulas, not to mention building up a bank of loot as you collect launch plans, by successfully navigating bases. I also really enjoyed the persistent DEFCON ratings for both sides that force you to play carefully or suffer the consequences in future playthroughs. I like CounterSpy for its excellent atmosphere. The art, sound, and music are all impeccable and deliver a bona fide Cold War-esque experience. The story, one of neutrality and equal contempt, is also admirable, welcome, and unique. Its 15-minute gameplay chunks are fun, but they suffer from occasionally frustrating controls and AI that seem inconsistent from one stage to the next. For more on CounterSpy and all things virtual espionage, keep it on IGN.
Gunfire! Look alive, soldier!